Obviously, in a military submarine, you don't want your presence triggered unless you want it known.
On May 22nd, 1968, Navy surveillance stations in Argentina, Newfoundland, and the Canary Islands recorded a series of approximately 15 hydroacoustic signals over a period of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. They originated approximately 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. The sounds were unique. Nothing like a typical seismic event or the normal undersea hum. It was a series of sharp, metallic bangs, like a ship violently ripping apart. While no one knew it at the time, these sounds marked the loss of a nuclear-powered submarine and the horrifying death of all 99 men on board.
The United States pledges before you its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma, to devote its entire heart and mind to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life.
On the morning of Monday, May 27, 1968, a group of families gathered at the foot of Pier 22 off Hampton Boulevard in Norfolk, Virginia. The weather that day was grim as a brutal nor'easter bore down on the city. But Allie Brueggemann was undeterred. She had dressed her 2 sons and daughter in their best clothes, and the family sat in their car, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the nuclear-powered submarine, USS Scorpion. On board was her husband, machinist mate first class, James K. Brueggemann. Much of the Scorpion's deployment was classified, and communication was infrequent. So it was a major relief when on Friday, May 24th, Commander Submarine Force Atlantic officials announced that the submarine was due to arrive in Norfolk at 1300 EDT that Monday. Now, as rain pounded on the windshield and the building winds rocked the car, Allie Brueggemann was anxious to finally see her husband. She didn't know exactly what USS Scorpion did while deployed, but anyone that sends a loved one to sea worries every day until they finally return. So she sat and waited for the hulking submarine to emerge from the low-hanging storm clouds that hung over the Chesapeake Bay. While by 1968, the nearly 8-year-old USS Scorpion was certainly showing her age, she once represented the latest in American nuclear-powered submarine technology. From German U-boats to American fleet submarines, both world wars demonstrated the deadly power of stealth attacks from beneath the sea. But even later iterations of World War II submarines like the American Tench class were primarily surface vessels that could only stay submerged up to 48 hours at a time and could only travel an anemic 2 knots while underwater. These limitations came from their diesel-electric power plants. Combustion engines needed oxygen and a way to exhaust fumes. Diesel engines were used to charge vast battery banks that then powered electric engines. But these diesel engines could only run on the surface, greatly limiting the power available while submerged. While it seemed crazy at the time, nuclear power was suggested as a solution to this problem as early as 1939 by the American physicist Ross Gunn. By the end of the war, there was considerable interest, not only in the destructive power of nuclear energy, but also its potential to produce steam and electricity. As research advanced, it was clear that nuclear energy could allow the development of compact, long-lasting power sources. Even before the first nuclear reactor produced energy at the Argonne National Laboratory in Idaho in December 1951, the United States Congress already approved a conceptual design for a nuclear-powered submarine in July of that same year. Under the supervision of Captain, later Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the United States Navy developed the pressurized water reactor for naval use. These reactors used enriched uranium oxide fuel and were cooled by ordinary water. The world's first nuclear-powered submarine, named USS Nautilus after the submarine in the Jules Verne novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, was laid down on June 14, 1952 at General Dynamics Electric Boat Division in Groton, Connecticut, and commissioned on September 30, 1954. While the Nautilus immediately broke a number of records for her unparalleled undersea abilities and range facilitated by her nuclear power plant, she was the first of her kind and came with a number of limitations. Still, she proved that nuclear energy was a viable power source undersea and kicked off a series of new nuclear-powered submarines in the United States. By the end of the decade, the United States Navy began producing their second production run of nuclear-powered subs, called the Skipjack class. These new submarines marked a major change in hull design as nuclear power allowed significantly improved underwater capabilities. While previous hulls were designed to offer stability and speed on the surface, Skipjack-class submarines featured a new teardrop hull design for improved hydrodynamics underwater. While they could only achieve a modest 15 knot speed on the surface, this more than doubled to an incredible 33 knots while submerged. The third of these 6 new submarines would be named USS Scorpion. Initially authorized in 1956, the Skipjack class of nuclear-powered submarines marked a generational change in American submarine design. Their teardrop hull and improved 5th-generation Westinghouse reactors made them the fastest submarines in the world when the Skipjack carried out her sea trials in March 1959, though her top speed was officially classified. They would remain the fastest U.S. nuclear-powered submarines until the introduction of the Los Angeles class in 1974. Each Skipjack-class submarine cost around $40 million to build. They would measure 251 feet 8 inches or 76.7 meters in length, with a beam of 31 feet 7.8 inches or 9.6 meters. They displaced 3,075 long tons when surfaced and 3,513 when submerged. Their 5th-generation nuclear reactors used heated water under high pressure to generate steam that would drive geared steam turbines. These could generate up to 15,000 shaft horsepower fed to a single screw, achieving up to 15 knots when surfaced and an impressive 33 knots when submerged. The Skipjacks were rated to dive to a max depth of 700 feet, and they could remain submerged for days, weeks, even months. Their range was really only limited by the food and supplies they carried for their approximately 93 crew members. They were equipped with 6 21-inch torpedo tubes in their bow and could carry 24 torpedoes. They could accommodate either the Mark 37, Mark 14, Mark 16, Mark 48, or even the Mark 45 Aster nuclear torpedoes. USS Scorpion SSN 589 was the third of 6 Skipjack-class submarines. Her hull was laid down by the Electric Boat Division of the General Dynamics Corporation in Groton, Connecticut, on August 20th, 1958. She was launched on December 19th, 1959, and christened by Elizabeth S. Morrison, daughter of Lieutenant Commander Maximilian Mellick Schmidt, who commanded the previous World War II-era USS Scorpion SS-278, the first submarine and 5th U.S. Navy ship to bear the name. SS-278 vanished with her entire crew in the Yellow Sea sometime after January 5th, 1944. It's believed that she sank after hitting a mine, as no Japanese record that can be attributed to her loss exists. Her wreck has never been found. The new USS Scorpion was commissioned on July 29, 1960. She was assigned to Submarine Division 62, Submarine Squadron 6. She set sail from New London, Connecticut on her first mission, a 2-month deployment to take part in NATO exercises with the 6th Fleet in European waters, on August 24, 1960. On September 10, 1961, her home port was transferred to Norfolk, Virginia, where she would remain for the rest of her career. For the next few years, Scorpion participated in a variety of exercises, practicing and preparing for confrontation with the Soviet Union. It was the depths of the Cold War, and nuclear-powered submarines were tasked with stalking and hunting Soviet vessels that could pose a threat to the United States. Much of these missions were classified. While nuclear-powered subs were at the front lines of the Cold War, fortunately, no major conflict ever unfolded. On April 10, 1963, the United States Navy was rocked by the loss of USS Thresher and the 129 men on board. Thresher was the lead vessel in the Permit class of nuclear-powered submarines, the generation of submarines that came directly after the Skipjack class. While they introduced many improvements for the Skipjacks, the Permits generally followed the same design. The tragic loss of one of the United States Navy's latest nuclear submarines only a little over a year into its career sparked massive public outcry and shock within the submarine service. It was the first loss of an American nuclear submarine and the Navy's worst submarine disaster. The inquiry that followed painted a damning picture of both nuclear submarine construction and operating practices. A widespread culture of risk-taking was exposed at nearly every level. Shipyard inspection practices were found to be dangerously lacking, with inadequate procedures for testing hull and seawater piping joint integrity. Worst of all, it was found that Thresher's main ballast blow system, an emergency system that forces air into the sub's ballast tanks in order to quickly surface, might have lacked sufficient power needed to operate, and might have even clogged with ice due to the rapid pressure changes as the submarine sank, rendering the critical life-saving equipment completely useless. The United States Navy was operating a fleet of expensive death traps. Something had to be done. In the wake of these damning findings, the United States Navy created what was called the Submarine Safety Program, or SubSafe for short. It was found that the overall design of the United States nuclear submarines was sound. The core issue came from poor maintenance and a handful of inadequate safety systems and procedures. The program produced a set of requirements for new submarines and modifications for current submarines in order to be certified subsafe. These included new emergency seawater shutoff valves and emergency blow systems, as well as several other new regulations. In response to these recommendations, USS Scorpion's deep dive was limited to just 500 feet, 200 less than what was originally intended. Her seawater and hydraulic piping, as well as her joints, were ordered inspected and replaced, a lengthy and expensive task. Her seawater shutoff valves and emergency blow system were also to be replaced and modified to allow better crew access during an emergency, a direct response to what is believed to have sunk the Thresher. USS Scorpion was nearing the end of her first major overhaul at the Charleston Naval Shipyard, which lasted from June 10, 1963 to April 28, 1964, when these new safety requirements were issued. While workers were able to assess and repair welds on her hull, the bulk of these modifications would have to wait. Unfortunately, subsafe coincided with a period of considerable strain on the United States Navy, both operationally and politically. The absurd demands of the Vietnam War, paired with the constant pressure to one-up the Soviet Union, left the United States naval fleet stretched thin. Unlike today, there was still some political pressure on the armed forces to operate efficiently and use tax dollars responsibly. The nuclear submarine program was enormously costly, and many of these submarines spent approximately 40% of their time in dry dock. It was found that implementing the subsafe safety requirements across the fleet would cost approximately $200 million to achieve full certification. On March 24, 1966, the commander of Submarine Squadron 6 drafted a confidential memorandum to Admiral Schade expressing his concern. Quote, "The inordinate amount of time currently involved in routine overhauls of nuclear submarines is a recognized source of major concern to the Navy as a whole, and the submarine force in particular, and stands as a source of acute political embarrassment." End quote. These concerns prompted Admiral David L. McDonald, Chief of Naval Operations at the time, to develop what was called the Planned or Reduced Availability Overhaul Program for the submarine fleet. The new concept was to be tested on USS Scorpion and USS Tenosa. McDonald's successor, Admiral Thomas Moorer, explained in a 1967 letter to Congressman William Bates that, quote, "It is the policy of the Navy to provide submarines that have been delivered without certification with safety certification modifications during regular overhauls. However, urgent operational commitments sometimes dictate that some items of the full safety certification package be deferred until a subsequent overhaul in order to reduce the time spent in overhaul." A memorandum dated April 5, 1968 revealed that Scorpion was not expected to be fully subsafe certified until 1974, more than 10 years after the loss of USS Thresher. Scorpion's reduced availability overhaul began on February 1, 1967 at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Short on both manpower and resources, virtually none of the critical safety improvements were carried out. While a proper overhaul for a standard submarine at the time typically cost upwards of $20 million and lasted up to 2 years, Scorpion's overhaul only lasted 8 months and cost $3.2 million. Of that total spent, $2.3 million was devoted alone to refueling and servicing her reactor, leaving less than $1 million for the rest of the submarine. This made it the cheapest submarine overhaul in U.S. Navy history. She re-entered service on October 6, 1967, and after a few months of type training in Virginia, she sailed for the Mediterranean Sea. On Monday, May 27, 1968, the submarine tender Orion sat in the driving wind and rain moored at Pier 22, waiting for the Scorpion to arrive. Nearby, families sat anxiously, waiting for the arrival of their loved ones. Normally, as she approached, the Scorpion would surface off the Virginia Capes and contact Submarine Squadron 6, notifying them of their impending arrival. At first, Captain James C. Bellow of the Orion, who was acting commander of Submarine Squadron 6 that day, didn't think much of the missed call. But by noon, his concern began to grow. Finally, at 12:40, Bellow telephoned headquarters to tell them the Scorpion had failed to arrive or contact them by radio. This launched an intense effort to make contact. But these calls were met with silence. The nuclear-powered submarine USS Scorpion was missing. Following her meager refit, the Scorpion received a new commander. Born in West Meadow, Maine on September 15, 1931, Commander Francis A. Slattery joined the Naval Academy as a midshipman in June 1950, graduating as an ensign in 1954. He briefly served on the destroyer Dowley before enrolling at the Submarine School in Groton, Connecticut in 1955. He served on different submarines before training to serve on nuclear-powered subs at the end of 1958. After his schooling, he served as an officer on USS Nautilus. By the time he assumed command of USS Scorpion in October 1967, the 37-year-old was relatively inexperienced, but the increasing need for new vessels and officers quickly elevated men through the ranks. And Slattery, while young, was a solid and decorated officer. He understood the new nuclear-powered submarines as well as anyone else placed in command at the time. When he headed for the Mediterranean on February 15, 1968, there was no reason to doubt Commander Slattery or his crew. The state of the Scorpion, on the other hand, was a cause of grave concern. She was not originally supposed to be deployed to the Mediterranean, but she stepped in at the last minute to replace USS Seawolf after she collided with another ship in Boston Harbor. As Scorpion made her way across the Atlantic and joined the 6th Fleet for operations in the Mediterranean, the newly refitted submarine suffered a series of malfunctions. She quickly racked up 109 unfulfilled work orders, including one for a potentially faulty trash disposal unit latch, a mundane but incredibly sensitive piece of equipment. She also lacked the emergency blow system and decentralized emergency seawater shutoff valves called for by SubSafe. Her stern and sail hydraulics suffered chronic problems and even caused the vessel to corkscrew out of control during a test dive off the coast of Puerto Rico in November 1967. This incident prompted a brief dry docking, but the issue was never fully solved. On her voyage across the Atlantic, she lost more than 1,500 gallons of oil from her conning tower. The issues were so numerous that her crew began to call her USS Scrap Iron. In a letter to his family, machinist mate 2nd Class David Burton Stone wrote that he and his fellow crew had to repair, replace, or jerry-rig pretty much every part of the submarine. While none of these were serious enough to take the vessel out of service, some were particularly concerning. Her refrigeration units chronically leaked Freon to the point that the Scorpion had to request new Freon at nearly every port and every time they linked up with another Navy ship, just to keep these units running. In another incident, water leaked into her shore power connection, sparking a minor electrical fire in an escape trunk. Even more concerning, leaking valves and other issues with her hull restricted dive depth to just 300 feet, less than half of what the Scorpion was designed to achieve, and 200 feet less than what was required by SubSafe. In late 1965, an ultrasonic inspection found 317 defects inside the submarine's internal welds. Further examination was meant to be carried out during her 1967 overhaul, but this testing never took place. Commander Slattery was well aware of these problems. The situation was so dire that he drafted an emergency request for repairs on March 23, 1968, stating that, quote, "the hull was in a very poor state of preservation." Slattery ended his request with a dire warning, writing that, quote, delay of the work an additional year could seriously jeopardize the Scorpion's material readiness, end quote. Despite the warnings, USS Scorpion carried on. Her mission was typical for the time: monitor Soviet submarine activity. She arrived in the Mediterranean in the second week of March, and was greeted by a storm so rough that it rocked the sub even while she was submerged. But she seemed to weather the storm all right, though it seemed to have rattled the crew. Scorpion completed an exercise on March 21st and sailed for Sicily's Augusta Bay, where she arrived on March 23rd. Not allowed to moor at the pier due to local concerns over her reactor, the sub dropped anchor offshore. While the men were promised 3 days shore leave, many of them were so consumed with mounting repairs, they never even left the ship. In a letter to his family, machinist mate David Stone wrote about the most serious of these repairs. One of the ship's largest pumps threw a motor bearing. It was a serious problem, as Stone expressed in his letter, writing, quote, 75% of all the SSNs and 100% of the SSBNs would have gone to the shipyard for this issue. Stone cared for his ship, but he felt that newer ballistic missile submarines were better cared for by the higher-ups. In 3 days, the problem was fixed, but new problems quickly emerged. On May 27th, one of the ship's 4 air conditioning compressors blew. This was an issue that Stone and his crew could not fix. He wrote to his family, quote, hope the weather doesn't get too warm in the next few months. While Stone was measured in his complaints about the Scorpion, others were far more vocal. Just 1 day later, on March 28th, radioman First Class Daniel Pettery got an unexpected reprieve. After 12 months of petitioning to get off Scorpion, he was finally being transferred to USS Skipjack. It was no secret that Pettery was unhappy with the conditions on Scorpion. In the previous year, he even petitioned for a transfer to the US Army, willing to risk a more dangerous deployment to Vietnam and jeopardizing 17 years with the Navy, just to get off the submarine. He was adamant that the rest of the crew shared his concerns. Despite these criticisms, he did have kind words for Commander Slattery and the new executive officer, David Lloyd. He felt that the new leadership was having a positive impact on morale. Slattery even petitioned to keep Pettery on board. But to Pettery's relief, Sublent ordered his departure. He left the submarine later that day. After wrapping up her time in the Mediterranean in early May, as the Scorpion sailed for the Strait of Gibraltar, Interior Communications electrician Joseph Underwood began coughing up blood. Concerned that Underwood might have contracted tuberculosis or another highly contagious respiratory disease, Commander Slattery and Executive Officer Lloyd deliberated on how to handle the situation. But then on May 16th, a dire message from Sublent made the decision for them. Sonar technician Bill Elrod's pregnant wife went into labor prematurely. The infant did not survive. Slattery knew all too well what Elrod and his family were going through. He and his wife lost their infant son 8 years prior. He would depart from the sub in Spain and fly to Norfolk to be with his wife. Underwood would also be transferred from the sub to receive medical treatment on shore. Word of what happened traveled quickly, and the men were told that a mailbag would be sent out with the 2 men. Many on board penned what would prove to be their final letters to their families. Many wrote of the somber mood on board after hearing about what happened to Elrod's child. But there was hope that this mission would be ending soon, and the sub would be home in Norfolk in just a few days. Just before midnight on May 16th, Scorpion surfaced just outside the breakwater of the harbor at Rota, Spain. She was met by a Navy harbor tug. The final letters were collected and handed off, while Elrod and Underwood stepped off the submarine and waved goodbye. The two vessels parted and the tug returned to Rota. The Scorpion's crew unlocked and stowed her Fairwater running lights, closed and latched the Fairwater doors, and tightly sealed the hatch that led to her Fairwater trunk. Then her ballast tanks were opened, and she slipped smoothly below the waves, diving to periscope depth. After a rough trim to ensure the sub was balanced, she dove deeper, trimmed once again, and then plunged to her cruising depth, where she would set sail for her next mission. She now carried 99 men. From Rota, her next mission was to provide cover for the ballistic missile submarine USS John C. Calhoun, which was leaving Rota at the same time on another top-secret mission. Scorpion was to distract two fast November-class Soviet submarines stationed in the area and lead them away from the Calhoun. Once the mission was completed, she sailed for the Azores, where she was to monitor and gather intelligence on a Soviet task force that included a brand new Echo-class nuclear submarine. The mission was shrouded in secrecy and required complete electronic silence. Not much is known about this final mission, but after around 2 days, at 2300 hours on May 21st, her work was complete, and Scorpion was ready to sail home for Norfolk. She ascended to periscope depth and raised her antenna. After listening for some time to ensure that they were clear of shipping traffic and other dangers, Captain Slattery began sending out a series of messages to the naval station at Rota. USS Scorpion used the radio call sign Brandywine, but atmospheric interference made the transmissions difficult. Finally, contact was established with a Navy communication station in Neimarker, Greece, but the connection was lost several times. After 3.5 hours of back and forth, Scorpion finally managed to relay what she needed to. They gave their position as well as several other updates. There was no indication that the sub was experiencing any mechanical issues or anything else that would jeopardize the mission. All seemed to be normal. They were the last messages ever received from USS Scorpion. She was scheduled to arrive in Norfolk, Virginia at 1300 hours on May 27, 1968. Over the coming days, a series of messages were sent to the submarine, some explicitly requesting a reply. But Scorpion never responded. There were potential technical and operational reasons why a submarine might fail to respond, but the continued silence was strange. Despite claims to the contrary, there was good reason to believe senior officers knew that something was wrong as early as May 22nd, but no official action was taken. It wasn't until 1300 hours on May 27th, with the families of the men on board waiting in the pounding rain, that the Scorpion's silence and failure to arrive in Norfolk prompt the Navy to declare a submiss. News of the missing submarine spread fast. Within hours, it was reported to President Lyndon Johnson, and at 6 p.m., CBS Evening News broadcast the story. Over the next few days, a massive search involving over 55 ships and 35 aircraft scoured the Atlantic for the missing sub. But it was already far too late. Not everyone who waited at Pier 22 on May 27th was unaware that the Scorpion hadn't been heard from since May 22nd. As the nor'easter raged, Radio Second Class Mike Hannon pulled up to the pier. He was horrified to see the families waiting in the storm. He was on duty at the Submarine Messaging Center during the 1600 to 2400 evening shift on Wednesday, May 22nd. He knew that the Scorpion had failed to make contact, and he witnessed several senior officers openly discussing the missing submarine. Over the coming days, he learned that not only was the leadership aware that the submarine had been lost, but they had even recorded the sounds of her demise. Hannon had a personal connection to the Scorpion. His best friend and mentor, steward's mate First Class Joe Cross, was one of the 99 men on board. He couldn't believe that the Navy allowed the families to gather at Pier 22, knowing full well that the Scorpion almost certainly would not arrive. Despite a massive search operation, no trace of USS Scorpion was found. The submarine was officially presumed lost on June 5, 1968. She was stricken from the record on June 30th. Immediately after Scorpion was declared lost, a court of inquiry was convened to investigate the disaster. Through the summer, 76 witnesses were interviewed. Meanwhile, an undersea search for the wrecked submarine and her nuclear reactor already began on May 27th, only hours after submiss was declared. The team, led by investigator John Craven, director of the Navy's Deep Submergence Systems Project, immediately turned its attention to the Navy's then top-secret sound surveillance system, or SOSUS, in the Atlantic. They focused on a series of sounds recorded at two networks, one at Newfoundland and the other on the Canary Islands. Using these sounds, researchers were able to identify a 12 by 12 square mile area about 400 miles southwest of the Azores. The civilian-crewed research ship USS Miser, the same ship used to find the wreck of USS Thresher, arrived in the area on June 10th to begin searching for the Scorpion. Each day, the Miser dragged a 1,400-pound steel sled approximately 30 feet over the ocean floor, capturing images every 30 seconds with a 35mm camera using an ultra-wide 9.8mm lens. Finally, on Monday, October 28th, images from run number 75 revealed the shattered remains of the Scorpion's bow, laying on the ocean floor. Over subsequent dives, the wreck, laying 9,800 feet or 3,000 meters below the surface, was extensively photographed, and key pieces of debris were retrieved for analysis. The bow was relatively intact, though heavily deformed. The stern, on the other hand, was completely destroyed, with pieces crushed into the reactor and operations compartments amidship. Her propeller shaft had dislodged and was laying outside the wreck on the sea floor. Her sail had also been sheared off. Her operations compartment amidship was completely shattered by the force of the sinking. Her engine room had telescoped approximately 50 feet forward into the hull. All of this suggests that the submarine was at least partially intact when she sank, with several compartments still unflooded when the vessel reached crush depth at around 1,530 feet, or 470 meters, causing a catastrophic implosion. But what caused the Scorpion to sink in the first place remains an unanswered question to this day. While the official investigation provided some theories, they never reached a definitive conclusion. '68 saw the loss of 4 separate submarines from 4 different countries. Only 2 months before the Scorpion was lost, the Soviet submarine K-129 vanished mysteriously in the Pacific, with all 98 hands on March 8, 1968. Since Scorpion was known to be gathering intelligence on a Soviet naval group shortly before she sank, many have suggested that she might have been intercepted or even targeted by an enemy submarine. The Navy found no evidence of a Soviet attack. The sounds recorded by sources did not match the sound signature that would have been produced by a torpedo hit. Furthermore, the Scorpion's wreck showed no signs of torpedo damage, and instead showed evidence of an internal explosion. The official investigation also found no evidence that would suggest sabotage. A popular theory among investigators was that one of Scorpion's own torpedoes doomed the submarine. It's speculated that one of the sub's Mark 37 torpedoes was somehow inadvertently activated and released to prevent an internal detonation. The torpedo then became fully armed and circled back to the nearest target, the Scorpion herself. But there's little evidence to support this theory. Others believe that a torpedo could have malfunctioned and detonated internally, similar to what took down the Soviet nuclear submarine Kursk in August of 2000. But there's little reason to believe that any of the torpedoes carried on Scorpion were any more prone to overheating or other issues that could cause such a failure than any other torpedo type. And the Scorpion's bow, which housed her torpedoes, is relatively intact, nothing like the damage found when a torpedo malfunction destroyed the Kursk. Other more mundane causes seem to be more likely. One of the many outstanding work orders filed for the Scorpion before her loss was for the submarine's trash disposal unit, or TDU. During normal operations, submarines like the Scorpion were equipped with a vertical tube in or around her galley, used to dispose of trash and other waste. The submarine would ascend to periscope depth, and then once the TDU was properly secured, the valve would be opened to the sea, releasing what was inside. While mundane, this procedure required precise training to ensure that the unit was properly latched. Otherwise, the valve could open the submarine to uncontrollable flooding. It's possible that while undergoing the procedure, Scorpion's TDU was not properly latched, either due to human error or a defect in the equipment. Once the TDU failed, the submarine began to quickly flood. Since Scorpion lacked updated emergency seawater shutoff valves and an emergency blow system, the flooding could have quickly overwhelmed the submarine, causing her to sink rapidly. While watertight compartments could have been sealed, it would not have been enough to keep the submarine from falling to her crush depth, where the unflooded compartments would have imploded, causing the damage observed at the wreck. On the 50th anniversary of the Scorpion's loss on May 22, 2018, acoustics expert Bruce Rule published an assessment positing that the Scorpion was lost due to a hydrogen explosion while charging her batteries. Only 10 months after the loss of the Scorpion, U.S. Naval Ships Command issued a change to the Nav Ship's Technical Manual, Section 9623.718. The change was simple but significant. Quote, "Do not enter the battery well of ships having open tank ventilation systems while a charge is in progress." End quote. The section goes on to state that, quote, "Experience has shown that all individual battery cell explosions have occurred while personnel were working in the battery tank during charge." End quote. Several pieces of the Scorpion were recovered by the U.S. Navy submersible Trieste II, including a broken battery cover. When analyzed, it was found that these pieces were covered in battery cell debris and showed signs that the battery covers were blown off. Battery cell debris was also found all over the Scorpion's wreck site. This suggests a violent explosion occurred before the batteries were submerged. The force of the blast was calculated at 10.2 to 13.6 bars. more than enough to kill anyone in the area. The blast would not have been strong enough to rupture the pressure hull on its own, but it would have been strong enough to create significant damage and cause flooding. Nuclear-powered submarines are able to charge their batteries even while submerged, but the charging process produces hydrogen gas, which can be flammable or even explosive in high enough quantities. To deal with this issue, these gases are dispersed throughout the sub and removed from the air using scrubbers, neutralizing the risk. But Scorpion might have been in a state of readiness called Condition Baker. This is when watertight hatches are closed while the submarine is at periscope depth to protect the vessel if any collision occurs. The sealed hatches could have allowed hydrogen gas to build up in her battery compartments, which could have been ignited by crew working in the area. A single static spark from their clothing could have been enough to set off the deadly explosion. This theory aligns with the acoustic signatures recorded during the event. The first sound, recorded at 18:20:44 GMT, had all the characteristics of a small internal event. The next sound, recorded 22 minutes later at 18:42:34, was a strong bubble pulse frequency of 4.46 Hz. This was probably the sound of the Scorpion's hull imploding. What followed was a series of small events, likely various smaller compartments around the ship collapsing. Based on this evidence, we can begin to grasp what might have happened in the Scorpion's final moments. The submarine was conducting various duties at periscope depth. While near the surface, her batteries were charged, producing deadly hydrogen gas, which was able to build up due to the closed hatches. One or more of the crew members in the area inadvertently sparked an explosion. This would have only been strong enough to kill those in the immediate area, meaning that probably more than half of the crew survived. Those in the aft engine room were probably protected by the sealed watertight doors. The blast caused significant flooding. Without an updated decentralized emergency blow system required by SubSafe but not installed on the Scorpion, there was nothing the crew could do after the blast to reverse the flooding or surface the submarine. She quickly began to sink. Her crew could only wait as she fell deeper and deeper. Finally, 22 minutes after the initial explosion, at approximately 1,530 feet, or 470 meters, the Scorpion reached her crush depth and imploded. The collapse occurred in just 37 milliseconds, faster than the blink of an eye. Those on board were crushed in an instant, but they had to spend 22 agonizing minutes waiting for the end. While the hydrogen explosion theory seems the most likely to me and to several others who have studied the loss of the Scorpion, there is still no official explanation for the loss of the nuclear-powered submarine. In November 2012, surviving family members in the U.S. Submarine Veterans Organization formally asked the United States Navy to reopen their investigation into the loss of the Scorpion. The request was rejected. I'm not equipped to assess the degree to which the issues which likely helped doom the Scorpion impact the United States Navy to this day. But in almost all aspects of life, there is a constant push and pull between safety and expediency. We live in a society that values capital over human life. My hope is that the lessons of the past continue to resonate with those who hold our lives in their hands. There's a popular saying in the Coast Guard that safety regulations are written in blood. If the lives lost mean anything, they will justify the costs required to preserve life in the future. We owe it to the dead to ensure that their lives were not lost in vain. February 1945, Seaman Second Class Thomas William Lamont II wrote a letter to his friend Margot back home in New York. It read, "We're getting ready to put to sea again, which is no longer quite the thrilling prospect it used to be. I often wish to blazes I were your age and beginning Exeter, or better still were Hayes's age, and just learning that Santa Claus is a big swindle. You probably hear a great deal of talk about war aims and post-war aims around the Sunday dinner table at Palisade, which is a good thing. But it is sometimes a bit hard to look at war as a chapter in a history book, or a lecture by a professor when you are out here. Well, perhaps I'm being a bit too serious. I always seem to put down profound thoughts when I pick up a pen. And I hope I see you all sometime, not too far away." Thomas wrote from the submarine USS Snook in Midway while preparing for their 9th patrol. By April 9th, the submarine and the 84 men on board vanished without a trace. "1942 was a pivotal year for the war in the Pacific. In June, the United States Navy dealt a devastating blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 of the Empire's valuable fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Suryu, and Hiryu. The unexpectedly decisive Allied victory successfully halted the Japanese offensive and began the years-long effort to force them back to the home islands. While Midway turned the tide of the war in America's favor, victory was still years away. The Japanese Empire was an island nation that depended on imported fuel and resources to power its war machine. Long before war broke out, American planners recognized a similarity: the United Kingdom. Throughout World War I, the German U-boat hunted British shipping and nearly tipped the tide of the war. The United States recognized that a similar strategy would be needed to starve the growing Japanese empire. But there were problems. Japan is nearly 6,000 miles away from the continental United States and 4,000 miles away from Hawaii. While the US had closer bases in the Philippines and Guam, there were serious concerns that these far-flung outposts would quickly fall to a Japanese offensive. All of this meant that in order to seriously threaten Japanese supply lines from below the sea, the United States would need a submarine fleet capable of covering considerable distances. They would need to be large, fast, and simple, able to survive far from friendly ports. Such a submarine fleet would be expensive. The interwar period in the United States was characterized by strong isolationist sentiments and naval treaties that aimed to prevent another world war. Americans rightly wanted to avoid ever getting involved in another European conflict. War was costly, and people didn't want to send their sons to be killed over the disagreements of foreign leaders. This meant that Congress at the time was reluctant to fund major military investments. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936 placed limitations on the size and capabilities of naval fleets. But after Japan officially denounced the agreements in December 1934 and the Nazis took power in Germany in 1933, another war seemed significantly more likely, and efforts to improve the American submarine took on a new urgency. The first wave of new designs that would be genuinely useful in the coming war was the Porpoise class, which was first authorized in 1934 and provided the basis for subsequent classes. These utilized diesel-electric engines and battery power to achieve range and respectable surface speeds. While troublesome throughout the war, diesel-electric propulsion systems improved considerably with the subsequent Salmon, Sargo, Tambor, and finally the Gato and Baleo classes, which would eventually make up the majority of the United States wartime submarine fleet. Several improvements were implemented in the years leading up to the war, including the installment of air conditioning in 1936. submarines created notoriously brutal working conditions. They were often sweltering and so humid that condensation was a major problem for electrical equipment on board. It was sometimes so hot that men would pass out at their stations. Air conditioning provided a significantly better working environment and allowed for the installation of increasingly complex electrical systems that would soon prove vital. Still, the Navy was well aware that submarines were a less desirable place for crews to work. To make up for this, subs were given better food and crews received higher pay. These efforts improved morale and elevated submarine crews to a higher status in the Navy. Despite these improvements, the submarine fleet faced numerous challenges, from persistent mechanical issues to problems in the chain of command that left captains overly cautious. Most severely, though, the Mark 14 torpedo, the standard US submarine torpedo during World War II, hardly ever actually worked in the early years of the war. The torpedo tended to run too deep. It frequently detonated before reaching its target. It often failed to detonate when it actually hit its target, and sometimes it had a nasty habit of running in a circle and returning to the ship that fired it. Still, by 1942, the United States industrial might had firmly transitioned to supporting the war machine, and new Gato-class submarines were taking shape at shipyards all over the United States, with a new sub arriving in Pearl Harbor almost every week. One of these new submarines taking shape in Kittery, Maine, was the USS Snook. The keel of SS-279 was laid down at the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Kittery, Maine on April 17, 1942. Construction was swift. The new submarine was launched on August 15, 1942. Christened by Mrs. Aubrey Emanuel Dempsey, the wife of Navy Cross honoree Lieutenant James C. Dempsey, the new submarine was named USS Snook, following the tradition of naming U.S. submarines after fish. The common snook is a bluish-gray Atlantic marine fish known for its aggression while feeding, particularly at dusk and dawn. Snook was a typical Gato-class submarine, coming in at 311 feet or 95 meters in length, with a beam of 27 feet or 8 meters. She displaced 1,525 tons while surfaced and was powered by 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines capable of generating 5,400 total horsepower. Power was stored in 2 massive 126-cell Sargo batteries. Her top surface speed could reach 21 knots, and while submerged, her General Electric battery-powered motors that could achieve a speed of 8.75 knots. She was armed by 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 in her bow and 4 in the stern. She was also equipped with a single 3-inch 50 caliber deck gun mounted on her bow forward of her conning tower that could be used while surfaced. She had 2 anti-aircraft guns, 1 forward and 1 aft. She would be operated by a crew of 6 officers and 54 enlisted men, though these numbers would sometimes fluctuate. Patrols would last 75 days. Onboard conditions were significantly better than those found on foreign and older American subs. The Gato class's larger size allowed designers to provide significantly improved living conditions. Crews enjoyed showers, air conditioning, refrigerated food storage, large freshwater distilling units, laundry, and bunks for every man on board. These improved conditions made up for the difficulties of living on a submarine, which even in a Gato-class sub was often cramped, claustrophobic, and stuffy. While submerged, breathing air consisted of what was captured while on the surface. This same air would remain until the sub resurfaced. With every breath, the air grew more dense. This was one of many reasons why these vessels could only remain submerged for a maximum of 48 hours. She was rated to a depth of 300 feet. Anything deeper threatened to implode her hull. Still, the Gato class was a significant improvement over the hellish conditions of previous subs. These improved conditions, combined with better food allocations and higher pay rates, made the submarine service somewhat desirable. Their officers and crews enjoyed an unofficial elite status in the Navy that surface crews sometimes envied. USS Snook was officially commissioned on October 24, 1942. Her first master was Lieutenant Commander Charles O. Tribal, a 1929 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Already an experienced and well-respected sub-commander, Tribal proved popular with his crews. Following her commissioning, Snook began her shakedown training off the coast of New England. Finally, on March 3, 1943, she began her voyage to the Pacific, where she would join the Allied war effort to fight Imperial Japan. USS Snook first arrived in Pearl Harbor on March 30, 1943. After just 12 days of dry docking, paint, and minor repairs and alterations, the Snook began its first patrol. Commander Tribal and his officers were disappointed to learn that their first assignment was a mine-laying mission. Hardly the action that the men on board were eager to engage in. Equipped with just 14 torpedoes, a little more than half of the 24 that she was designed to carry, Snook slipped out of Pearl Harbor escorted by a destroyer. Not long after clearing the harbor, they submerged. Moments later, 2 depth charges rocked the brand new submarine. They were dropped intentionally at a distance far enough away so as not to damage the submarine, but close enough to rattle her new crew. Sufficiently broken in, Commander Tribal set a course for Midway Island. After a brief stopover, they continued to the Yellow and East China Seas, where they laid mines around Shanghai. Once this task was completed, she continued up the coast of China. In the coming month, at least 2 Japanese freighters would fall prey to the hidden mines, the 1,992-ton Takamisan Maru and the 3,948-ton Hakozaki Maru. With the mine laying completed, Tribal and its men finally had the chance to do what they set out for: hunt Japanese shipping. Over the coming days, they encountered and attacked a series of small Japanese fishing boats and junks, but it wasn't until May 5th that they would finally encounter their first 2 major targets. Conditions were less than ideal. Persistent fog made it difficult to spot potential targets. Perhaps even worse, the sea was calm. A smooth sea made periscopes easier to spot. At 1818, the officer of the deck sighted a Japanese freighter approximately 7,000 yards away. As they closed in, another freighter came into view. Snook trailed the 2 ships until nightfall. In the cover of darkness, Tribal set his sights on the trailing freighter. They fired 3 torpedoes, dealing a crippling blow to the 1,268-ton Kinko Maru. At first, the lead freighter, the 3,194-ton Deifuku Maru, failed to realize in the darkness that their companion was mortally wounded. But then, someone on the sinking ship began blowing a whistle, tipping them off to the danger. The Deifuku Maru began evasive maneuvers. Snook fired 2 torpedoes, but missed the zigzagging freighter. Then the Deifuku Maru opened fire on the sub with her deck guns, forcing them to dive and withdraw. But after regrouping, Tribal moved in once again. This time, they scored a successful hit amidship, sending a devastating explosion through the Japanese freighter. She sank quickly. Her crew continued to fire on the retreating sub until the very end. Still armed with 6 torpedoes, Snook carried on searching for enemy targets. 2 days later, she encountered a new enemy convoy. After moving into position, Snook fired on the ships, damaging several, including the 4,363-ton cargo ship Tosei Maru. Over the coming days, Tribal and his crew sank at least 1 more cargo ship and a few small vessels before returning to Midway on May 23, 1943, putting an end to a highly successful first patrol. But the new submarine was just getting started. June 9, 1943, USS Snook set out on her next patrol, hunting for enemy shipping in the waters off the Ryukyu Islands. In the coming days, she would damage or sink several Japanese freighters, making for another successful mission. Over the coming months, her subsequent patrols would prove equally effective. During her fifth patrol on February 8, 1944, off the western coast of Kyushu, she encountered a 13-ship convoy. Acting quickly, Snook fired 4 torpedoes before diving to evade the convoy's escorts. As they fled, they heard 3 explosions, followed by the sounds of a large ship breaking up. The attack was a success. The sinking ship was the 6,989-ton troop transport Lima Maru. At the time, she carried 2,900 men of the Japanese 19th Brigade. Less than 150 people survived the sinking. With an estimated 2,765 dead, the Lima Maru is the 11th highest loss of life in a ship sunk by a submarine in all history. USS Snook finished her 5th patrol in Pearl Harbor on March 6, 1944. The patrol was considered a great success and marked the end of Commander Triball's time with the sub. As was customary, he received a promotion and joined the Bureau of Ordnance, which sent him to the States for the rest of the war. Command of USS Snook was passed over to a new leader, Lieutenant George H. Brown, who recently completed a PCO patrol with Triball. A 1934 graduate of the Naval Academy, Brown was already an experienced S-boat skipper, having served 3 patrols in Alaska before assuming his first fleet boat command. After a major overhaul in California, Snook set out for his 6th patrol on June 24, 1944. By then, Operation Forager, the campaign to capture the Mariana Islands, was already underway as American forces ground away at Imperial Japan. Despite an opportunity to sink 2 freighters on June 12, the mission ended on August 14th without success. By this point in Snook's career, most of her original crew and officers had been replaced with new men. One of these new crew members was Seaman 2nd Class Thomas William Lamont II. Thomas left Harvard and joined the Navy in late 1942. With his education and background, he was offered a place in the Navy's V-12 officer training program. But Thomas turned down the opportunity, instead choosing to join as an enlisted man, because he wanted to see action as soon as possible. After completing boot camp, he entered the submarine service and trained aboard S-34 before being assigned to USS Snook on August 28, 1944. He joined just before one of Snook's darkest patrols. While by 1944 the Americans were making steady progress in pushing back the Japanese Imperial Navy, the early days of the war were an entirely different story. As predicted, the American base in the Philippines came under attack only hours after the Japanese first launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. At the time, the Philippines was home to some 20,000 US troops and 100,000 Filipino troops. After months of brutal fighting, the islands fell to the Japanese. The US and Filipino defenders were pushed to the Bataan Peninsula, where they were eventually forced to surrender. Following their defeat, the approximately 75,000 POWs were forced to march from Mariveles on the southern end of the Bataan Peninsula to Camp O'Donnell, a prison camp 65 miles away. It's estimated that between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipinos and 500 to 650 Americans died during the march due to the severe physical abuse, starvation, and lack of water inflicted by the Imperial Japanese Army soldiers. It was dubbed the Bataan Death March. For the survivors, conditions at Camp O'Donnell were appalling, with an estimated 400 prisoners dying every single day. By summer 1942, Camp O'Donnell was closed, and the POWs housed there were transferred to other camps. As the war dragged on and Japan's resources began to dwindle, there was a growing need for labor. They began transporting POWs to Japan and other occupied territories where they would be forced to work to replenish war materials. Conditions on the ships that transported them were indescribable. Men were tightly packed into cargo holds with no ventilation. Barely able to move or even sit down, prisoners had to endure seasickness and temperatures that often exceeded 100 degrees. Voyages would last weeks with no food or water. Prisoners dubbed these the Hell Ships. One of these ships was the Arizon Maru, a 6,886-ton former troop transport, which departed Manila on October 21, 1944. Packed into her cargo holds were 1,781 mostly American POWs, bound for Takao in Taiwan. Originally assigned to a convoy of 13 ships, the group broke up when American submarines were detected in the area. Arizon Maru, now alone, made a dash for Taiwan. A little less than 2 weeks before, on October 4th, USS Snook set out for the sub's 7th patrol. Upon reaching the Bashi Channel between the Philippines and Taiwan, Snook came across the scattering Japanese convoy on October 23rd. First, she sank the 5,863-ton cargo ship Shinsei Maru No. 1. Next, she took out the 3,887-ton tanker Kakusai Maru. Finally, she came across one last large vessel and opened fire. A single torpedo ripped into the Arizon Maru. The old ship quickly broke apart, sending the POWs trapped inside spilling into the sea. Just 4 were picked up by other Japanese ships and quickly sent back into custody. Incredibly, 5 men were able to climb aboard one of the ship's lifeboats. Thanks to one of the men's sailing experience, the group was able to evade Japanese ships and sail all the way to the Chinese coast, where they were picked up by the friendly crew of a Chinese junk. The 5 men made it all the way to an airbase, and eventually they returned to the United States. Without them, the story of the Arizon Maru might not have ever been told. Only 9 of the 1,781 POWs aboard survived the sinking. It's thought to be one of the greatest losses of American life at sea in all history. But the men on board USS Snook had no idea. To them, the unmarked vessel was just another Japanese cargo ship. They returned to Pearl Harbor on November 18, 1944, and were lauded for what was thought to be another highly successful mission. None of them realized what they had done, or that this would be Snook's final taste of success. George Brown's time with USS Snook was short. After just 2 patrols as captain, he was replaced by Commander John Franklin Walling. Born in Providence, Rhode Island on February 2, 1912, Walling grew up in Nantucket and returned to the island whenever he got a chance. Always a top student, he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1935. He spent the next 2 years on the heavy cruiser USS Tuscaloosa before enrolling at the Naval Submarine School in New London in 1937. He then served on the old USS S-37 for 3 years before joining the newly completed USS Flying Fish in August 1941. It was around this time that he met his future wife, Doris Annabella Helmkamp, the daughter of a U.S. Navy commander. It's clear from his letters that he fell madly in love with Annabella from the moment they met. They married in Coronado, California in 1943 and purchased a modest house in Mystic, Connecticut, where they planned to raise a family after the war. Walling was with USS Flying Fish as the sub took part in the Battle of Midway. He briefly commanded USS S-48 and USS Marlin in the Atlantic before he took command of USS Snook on December 5, 1944. I've been out of the States for 7 months. A lot of guys have been out 27 months. They've made 1 patrol. A lot of guys have made 7 or 8 or more. What action I've seen has been pretty one-sided. As yet, I haven't been hurt, or scared, or lived in filth or gone more than 24 hours without sleep. So the natural assumption is that perhaps I am talking out of turn. And perhaps I am. Well, we shall see how one pan out. You said at the end of your letter that you admired my patriotism and contribution to the war effort. You said you were proud of me. Kind words, Pa, but undeserved. At the risk of being dramatic, I can say that I am not afraid to die and seldom give it a thought. But frankly, you are the patriot. I am just a limelight artist. I am in a damn good service, and I'd rather be a swab jockey in a sub than a captain on a tanker or a transport. My ardor for action is not dampened as yet, but my homesickness is running riot and tips the scales. After a few more runs, I might even swallow my pride and take stateside duty. But presently, I am still curious. I'm curious as hell. Seaman Second Class Thomas William Lamont II, December 20th, 1944. While in Midway, Snook's crew took a photo on deck with the submarine scorecard. It was the last picture most of them would ever take. USS Snook set out for her 8th patrol on December 25, 1944. Conducted off the Kuril Islands, no enemy shipping was spotted, and the patrol ended without any engagement on February 17, 1945. After some minor repairs, Snook left the submarine base in Guam for her 9th patrol on March 25, 1945, but she returned 2 days later for emergency repairs. Back in working order, she departed on March 28th and sailed for the Luzon Strait, where she was to link up with USS Tigran to join an attack group. Her radioman William Laurie Dolph, Ben Alvin Branham Jr., and technician Russell Lee Baum sent daily weather updates until April 1st, when these reports were stopped to prevent them from giving away their position. For the next week, Snook remained in contact with USS Tigran, but these transmissions stopped on April 9th. On the 10th, Snook was ordered eastward, and on the 12th she was ordered to perform lifeguard duty for a British carrier while it conducted airstrikes near Sakashima Gunto. Snook was not required to acknowledge these orders. Then, on April 20th, Snook was ordered to search for a plane from the British carrier that was shot down near their location. Again, Snook remained silent. USS Bang was sent to the area to rendezvous with the sub. They found and rescued the downed pilots, but there was no trace of the missing sub. On May 14, 1945, Annabella Walling received the following telegram. The Navy Department regrets to inform you that your husband, Commander John Franklin Walling, USN, is missing following action while in the service of his country. The department appreciates your great anxiety, but details not now available, and delay in receipt thereof must necessarily be expected. Snook and her crew were officially announced overdue and presumed lost on August 5th, 1945. To this day, the exact cause of Snook's loss is unknown. On April 14, 1945, the Japanese escort ship Okinawa, together with escorts CD-8 and CD-32, dropped depth charges on an unknown submarine, but it's unclear whether the attack was successful, or if the submarine was USS Snook. There are no other Japanese records from the time or area that can be attributed to the loss. Some historians believe Snook was sunk by the Japanese submarine I-56, which disappeared in mid-April, likely sunk by American destroyers on April 18th. A number of other Japanese subs in the area met a similar fate, and any of them could have encountered Snook. That could explain why no record exists. In 1995, deep-sea divers found a radar blip that they thought could be the wreck of an unknown American submarine off the coast of Irremote Island. But no one has been able to investigate their findings or identify whether they even found a wreck at all. It's impossible to know for sure what took place in the chaotic final months of World War II. Submarines are blind killing machines. They're designed to strike without warning before vanishing into the shadows. It's hard to imagine what life on board would have been like, and all the more impossible to imagine the end. For the 84 men on board, Snook became their graves. Was it quick? Painfully slow? Until the wreck is found, we'll never know. Like so many millions, they died over the disagreements and ambitions of men they never met, somewhere below the waves, in the black abyss of the sea. Sunday, May 2nd, 1943, only a week after leaving New London, Connecticut to report for duty in Honolulu, lookouts on the newly completed USS Harder spotted an incoming PBY patrol bomber approximately 5,000 yards away and closing in fast. Commander Samuel Dealey remained in the designated safety lanes for U.S. shipping. He considered it safe enough to remain on the surface in the relatively uncontested Caribbean waters. But when the U.S. Navy flying boat was spotted, Dealey's crew flashed the day's recognition sign from their signal lamp. Before they could even finish the signal, the patrol bomber opened fire. Their machine guns sent a spray of bullets along the submarine's starboard side. Acting quickly, Commander Dealey ordered an emergency crash dive. As the Harder plunged beneath the waves, the bomber circled overhead and dropped 2 depth charges. One hit close enough to rattle the new submarine, but fortunately, they escaped unharmed. The USS Harder continued to the Pacific, where she would carry out one of the most impressive service records of any submarine in the history of the United States. A career that would be cut horrifically short. While World War I was meant to be the war to end all wars, the United States began planning for the next world conflict before the Great War even came to an end. Naval planners were keenly aware of the effectiveness of the Kaiser's U-boat fleet, which spent most of the war terrorizing the United Kingdom's war effort. Many of Germany's greatest triumphs during the war came at the barrel of a torpedo tube. The United States was intrigued by the underwater fleet that nearly crippled the mighty Royal Navy, and it was clear that submersibles would be a valuable asset in the wars to come. Planners rightly assessed that the United States' next conflict would likely be with the increasingly volatile Japanese Empire. This presented a number of challenges for the US Navy as they worked to develop an effective submarine fleet. Mainland Japan is over 6,000 miles away from the United States homeland. While the US had important bases in Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, it was uncertain how vulnerable the latter two would be in the event of a war. No matter the case, it was important that submarines would be capable of traveling great distances without needing to refuel or resupply, and they would need to travel quickly to cover these distances in a reasonable amount of time, as well as keep pace with surface fleets. They would also need to be rugged and at least semi-capable of repair while on missions far away from any port. At the same time, the interwar period was defined in the US by strong isolationist views. Americans were rightly concerned about engaging in an arms race that would reignite international tensions and prompt another horrifying war. At the same time, Japan's rise and the increasing instability in Europe were a legitimate cause for concern. Two major peacetime treaties attempted to stymie a simmering naval arms race: the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936. These agreements placed limitations on the size and types of warships the major powers were allowed to build. But Imperial Japan felt unfairly restrained by the Washington Naval Treaty and officially denounced the agreement in December 1934. The Empire also refused to participate in the Second London Naval Treaty. But the United States was a signatory to both agreements and was therefore limited in the size of submarine that they were able to build. This, along with financial and logistical restraints enacted by Congress, kept the US submarine fleet small and rife with issues. The first class of fleet submarines produced in significant numbers after World War I was the S-class. These vessels were more of a draft of what was to come. While several of the 65 S-class submarines were eventually used in World War II out of necessity, it was clear before the war that these vessels would struggle to effectively threaten the Japanese Imperial Navy. As the treaty system fell apart in the mid-1930s, and war seemed increasingly inevitable, planners began significantly improving the American submarine. The first wave of new designs that would be genuinely useful in the coming war was the Porpoise class, which was first authorized in 1934 and provided the basis for the subsequent classes. These utilized diesel-electric engines and battery power to achieve range and respectable surface speeds. While troublesome throughout the war, diesel-electric propulsion systems improved considerably with the subsequent Salmon, Sargo, Tambor, and finally the Gato and Vallejo classes, which would eventually make up the majority of the United States wartime submarine fleet. Several improvements were implemented in the years leading up to the war, including the installment of air conditioning in 1936. Submarines created notoriously brutal working conditions. They were often sweltering and so humid that condensation was a major problem for electrical equipment. It was sometimes so hot that men would pass out at their stations. Air conditioning provided a significantly better working environment and allowed for the installation of increasingly complex electrical systems that would prove vital in the coming war. But the Navy was well aware that submarines were less desirable for crews. To make up for this, subs were given better food and crews received higher pay. These efforts improved morale and elevated submarine crews to a higher status in the Navy. Despite these improvements, the submarine fleet faced numerous challenges, from persistent mechanical issues to problems in the chain of command that left captains overly cautious. Even worse, the Mark 14 torpedo, the standard US torpedo during World War II, hardly ever seemed to actually work in the early years of the war. The torpedo tended to run too deep, it frequently detonated before reaching its target, it often failed to detonate when it actually hit its target, and it sometimes had a nasty habit of running in a circle and returning to the ship that fired it. Fortunately for the United States Navy, many of these issues had been fixed or at least somewhat improved during the early years of the war, and by 1944 the submarine had become a major threat to the Imperial Japanese Navy and its merchant fleet. A number of submarines and their commanders earned a reputation for their bravery and effectiveness. Samuel David Dealey was perhaps one of the most well-respected of this new crop of undersea heroes. Samuel David Dealey was born on September 13, 1906 to a prominent family in Dallas, Texas. Dealey Plaza, where President Kennedy would later be assassinated, was named after Dealey's Uncle George. The youngest of 5 children, Samuel Dealey was only 6 years old when his father passed away. His mother briefly moved the family to Colorado and then to Santa Monica, California, but they returned to Dallas by the time Dealey finished high school. He spent 2 years at Southern Methodist University before he enrolled in the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland in 1925. But he quickly proved to be a pretty bad student. He struggled with math and chemistry, and he also received several demerits before flunking out in his first year. But Dealey wasn't deterred, and he earned re-entry in 1926 and finally graduated in 1930. The same year, he married Edwina Vater, a high school sweetheart he met back in Santa Monica. The two remained close through letters throughout his time in Dallas and Annapolis. Together they had 3 children, Joan, David, and Barbara Lee. Dealey began his naval career on the battleship Nevada. In 1933, he was promoted to lieutenant, and in 1934, he transferred to the destroyer USS Rathburn. But Samuel Dealey was an ambitious young man, eager to rise through the ranks so that he could earn better pay and spend more time with his family. Plus, he wanted to command his own ship. In the summer of 1934, he enrolled in the submarine school at New London, Connecticut. While submarine service could be brutal, it provided a fast track to promotion. After he graduated, Dealey served on several submarines, including S-34, S-24, USS Nautilus, the first one, not the cool one, and USS Bass. He briefly returned to surface duty and continued to rise through the ranks until he finally requested a return to submarine duty. At one point, he even considered leaving the Navy and returning home to Dallas. But in April 1941, he was placed in command of USS S-20, an S-class sub used to support experiments and training in New London, Connecticut. He was still in command of S-20 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. While he continued his service with the training submarine, it was clear that his skills were needed in the Pacific. And a year later, he was assigned commanding officer of one of the new Gato-class submarines being built in New London, the nearly completed USS Harder. The result of years of trial and error, the Gato-class was mass-produced just before and just after the United States entered World War II. While they still had their limitations, they were a significant improvement over what came before. Laid down by the Electric Boat Company at Groton, Connecticut on December 1, 1941, less than a week before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the USS Harder was a typical Gato-class submarine. She was named after the Harder, a fish of the mullet family found off the coast of Namibia and South Africa, part of the US Navy's tradition at the time of naming their submarines after fish. USS Harder featured a partial double hull, consisting of an inner pressure-resistant hull surrounded by an outer hydrodynamic hull. The two merged at her forward and aft torpedo room bulkheads. She could carry enough fuel and provisions to sail from Hawaii to Japan and back. This required a larger vessel that made her slower to dive and harder to maneuver. She measured 311 feet or 95 meters in length, with a beam of 27 feet or 8.3 meters, and came in at 1,525 long tons wind surfaced and 2,424 long tons wind submerged. She was powered by 4 notoriously faulty Hooven-Owens Rentschler diesel engines that drove electrical generators. These powered 4 high-speed Allis-Chalmers electric motors with reduction gears that drove 2 propellers. 2 massive 126-cell Sargo batteries stored electricity. She was capable of an impressive 21 knots while surfaced and 9 knots while submerged. She had a range of 11,000 nautical miles and could remain underwater for up to 48 hours. She could dive to a depth of 300 feet, an improvement over previous generations of submarine. Her armaments included 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft. She carried 24 torpedoes, as well as 1 3-inch 50 caliber deck gun, and a Bofors 40mm and Oerlikon 20mm cannon. She was operated by a crew of 6 officers and 54 enlisted sailors. Patrols would last up to 75 days. The Gato class's larger size allowed designers to provide significantly improved living conditions. Crews enjoyed showers, air conditioning, refrigerated food storage, large freshwater distilling units, laundry, and bunks for every man aboard. These luxuries left officers from foreign navies in awe when they visited the American submarines. Even the United Kingdom's Royal Navy Submarine Service lagged far behind. USS Harder was launched on August 19, 1942, and christened by Miss Helen M. Shafroth, the daughter of Rear Admiral John F. Shafroth, Jr. The submarine was officially commissioned on December 2, 1942, and placed under the command of Samuel David Dealey. In April 1943, after a series of trials and shakedown cruises, USS Harder began the long voyage to her new home in Pearl Harbor. Samuel Dealey easily found his place in the exclusive ranks of submarine commanders. During its peak, just 4,000 officers served in the submarine service, and only a fraction was ever elevated to master their own vessel. Many submarine skippers came from prominent families, including the sons of Admirals Nimitz, McCain, Kimmel, and Spruance. Dealey, coming from a prominent Southern family himself, fit right in, and quickly earned the admiration of his crews. He had an infectious smile and a friendly, warm demeanor. Strict enough to earn respect, but not so much as to cause resentment. As his reputation grew, he was quick to credit his officers. He once said of Frank Lynch and Sam Logan, "With these 2 madmen pushing me all the time, there was nothing I could do but go along." After a long voyage that took them from Connecticut and through the Panama Canal, USS Harder finally arrived at her new base in Pearl Harbor on May 23, 1943. After a quick dry docking and some training, she was ready to sail west to Japan. By mid-1943, the war in the Pacific began to turn in America's favor. The aggressive Japanese offensive, kicked off by the attack on Pearl Harbor, had been halted by the United States' decisive victory in the Battle of Midway. Now, after a period of stalemate, the US was beginning to grind away at the Japanese Imperial Navy's ability to wage war. Japan was hopelessly outmatched by the industrial might of the United States. They struggled to replace lost shipping, while the US relentlessly churned out warships and freighters. Focusing on their enemy's oil supply lines, the US picked away at Japanese shipping as they prepared to undertake their island-hopping offensive. Submarines would play a vital role in this strategy. USS Harder left Pearl Harbor for her first patrol on June 7, 1943. By June 20th, aided by the cover of heavy rainfall, the sub approached the coast of Japan. They were so close that Dealey claimed that he could smell the camphor wood and eucalyptus trees on the beach. On June 23rd, she managed to work her way inside a picket line and spotted a small merchant convoy escorted by a lone warship. Harder went into battle stations and dove, moving in for an attack. Dealey fired 4 torpedoes, but only one successfully struck the Japanese auxiliary oiler Kioi Maru No. 3. Harder dove and maneuvered to avoid a counterattack, but a miscalculation sent the submarine too deep and she slammed into the ocean floor. 12 enemy depth charges exploded overhead, rattling the stranded sub. But aside from severely damaging her JKQC sonar, Harder was unharmed. After considerable effort, she was finally dislodged from the mud and able to resume her mission. The next day, they encountered the 7,000-ton seaplane transport Sagura Maru, a converted cargo liner. Dealey fired 4 torpedoes. One struck the ship's bow, dealing significant damage. As she limped away, she developed a 10-degree list. Dealey could have given chase and finished off the ship, but not wanting to press his luck, he decided to withdraw. A Japanese destroyer arrived soon after and towed the sinking Sagura Maru to the beach. A few days later, another US submarine, USS Pompano, spotted the stranded ship and fired 2 torpedoes, crippling her beyond repair. Over the coming days, Dealey and his crew managed to spot and fire on several more vessels. They ended their first patrol on July 7th. Her first outing was considered a great success, especially for a new vessel and crew. Dealey was initially credited with sinking 3 Japanese freighters and damaging 4 other ships. However, further review by the Joint Army and Navy Assessment Committee after the war showed that they probably only successfully sunk the Sagura Maru. Still, it was a great achievement. But USS Harder was just getting started. By the time USS Harder returned from her first patrol to Midway on July 7, 1943, one of her 4 diesel engines had completely broken down. Harder was one of 12 Gato-class subs equipped with Hooven-Owens-Rentschler diesel engines. These proved incredibly unreliable. After replacing numerous parts, the engine was finally repaired, and Harder left for her second patrol on August 24th. Despite almost constant engine trouble, this patrol was even more successful than the first. Dealey was credited with sinking 5 ships, including a valuable tanker, the nearly 6,000-ton Daishin Maru off Nagoya Bay. Tankers were especially sought-after targets as the United States worked to cut off Japan's oil supplies. Divisional Commander R.M. Peacher remarked that Dealey was aggressive, determined, and goes in close. His early success earned Dealey a promotion to full commander after they returned to Pearl Harbor on October 7, 1943. He was also awarded the Navy Cross for the success of his first patrol. As the United States geared up for the invasion of Tarawa, their first offensive campaign in their island-hopping strategy, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Fleet, ordered USS Harder to join USS Snook and USS Pargo for her third patrol. German U-boats used wolf packs to great effect in World War I, and the Japanese were using increasingly large convoys to protect their shipping, as US submarines began to pose a greater threat. These attack groups also allowed senior officers to observe the notoriously independent submarine patrols a bit more directly. Leaving Pearl Harbor on October 30th, 1943, the three subs sailed for the Marianas. As they closed in on their first enemy convoy, communication issues hampered any real coordinated attacks. The would-be wolf pack quickly dissolved into a barely useful information-sharing network. It was clear that at least for the time being, independent patrols would be more effective, and the group broke apart to finish their patrols on their own. On November 19th, USS Harder encountered a convoy of about a dozen Japanese ships. Dealey attacked, firing 10 torpedoes into the convoy. After evading a counterattack from a Japanese escort, he fired 11 more torpedoes. With no torpedoes remaining, USS Harder returned to Hawaii on November 30th. The patrol sank 3 Japanese freighters. Throughout this third patrol, USS Harder was again plagued by engine trouble, with one of her 4 engines failing completely and the other 3 barely held together with basically nothing but spit and gum. The Hoover and Owens Rentschler engines had overstayed their welcome. On December 5th, USS Harder was sent to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in San Francisco to be re-engined. When he arrived in San Francisco, Dealey's wife Edwina and their children met him at the docks. While the Harder underwent her overhaul, Dealey and his family spent some time in California before traveling to Dallas to spend Christmas at home. The 2-month leave was the last time Samuel Dealey would ever see his family. In addition to brand new General Motors Cleveland Model 16278A V-type diesel engines, USS Harder received several other improvements during her overhaul in San Francisco. Her 3-inch deck gun was replaced with a 4-incher. Her torpedo rooms were modified to accommodate the new and improved Mark 18 torpedo. She was equipped with a new extended and air-conditioned conning tower with a raised periscope. And she was even given a brand new ice cream freezer. She arrived in Pearl Harbor on February 27, 1944, and after some additional modifications and an 8-day training period, she left for her 4th patrol on May 16th. This time she was joined by USS Seahorse, a Vallejo-class submarine. She was sent to the Caroline Islands and assigned lifeguard duty to rescue downed aviators. On April 1st, Dealey learned of a downed pilot on the beach of Woolley in the western Caroline Islands. The pilot was soon sighted, and USS Harder nosed herself against the reef about 1,200 yards from the beach. With battle stations manned, J.W. Thomason, the ship's cook, and Francis X. Ryan, a motor machinist's mate, rowed a small rubber boat out to pick up the exhausted pilot, while Lieutenant Samuel M. Logan carefully maintained Harder's position. Under the threat of Japanese snipers in the violently churning sea, the men worked to pull the pilot to safety. At one point, the line between the rubber boat and harbor broke. Freeman Packett Jr., a gunner's mate, ran a new line and helped pull the stranded sailors in. Logan, Ryan, Thomason, and Packett were each awarded the Navy Cross for the daring rescue. USS Harder resumed her patrol. On April 13th, she was spotted by an enemy plane that sent the Japanese destroyer Ikazuchi to take out the American sub. As the destroyer closed in, Dealey went on the attack, firing 4 torpedoes. 2 struck the destroyer, and she quickly sank approximately 200 nautical miles south-southwest of Guam, taking her entire crew to the bottom. A few days later, Harder sank the 7,000-ton freighter Matsumaru. The final days of her 4th patrol were spent bombarding an airstrip in Woolley. Low on fuel, she sailed to Fremantle, Australia on May 3rd. Her 4th patrol was one of her most diverse and successful. With his tonnage racking up and his sunken destroyer, Samuel Dealey easily earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive and effective commanders in the U.S. Navy's submarine fleet. But Dealey was just getting started. once feared Japanese destroyers were now a prime target for the newly emboldened US submarines. With this new confidence, USS Harder left Fremantle on May 26, 1944 to begin her 5th patrol. This time she was joined by USS Redfin and sailed for the waters off Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines. On the night of June 6th, she intercepted a convoy guarded by 2 destroyers. Harder gave chase on the surface, bathed in the moonlight. As the Minutsuki turned to confront her, Harder submerged and fired 3 torpedoes at the onrushing destroyer. 2 hit and exploded. The 1,500-ton ship plunged to the bottom in only about 5 minutes. She fired 6 more torpedoes at the remaining convoy, but they all missed. Harder dove to a depth of 400 feet and fled the scene. The next day, Harder encountered the Hayanami. Again, she rushed the destroyer and fired 3 torpedoes at almost point-blank range. 1 hit the ship's magazine, igniting a massive explosion that ripped the ship apart. Her burning wreckage plunged beneath the waves in only about a minute, taking 208 sailors with her. The 45 survivors were later picked up by the destroyer Urakazi. Next, Harder headed to the coast of Borneo, where she briefly struck bottom and used her radar to help rescue a group of 6 Australian Special Forces. That night, she spotted 2 more Japanese destroyers. Dealey rushed in and fired 4 torpedoes at the overlapping targets, almost immediately sinking the Tanakazi. Her 126 survivors were also picked up by the destroyer Urakazi, but they went down with her when she was sunk by USS Sea Lion a few months later, going down with all hands. Harder sailed back toward Tawi-Tawi and observed a large Japanese task force with 3 battleships, 4 cruisers, and several destroyers. Soon a patrol plane spotted Harder and a Japanese destroyer raced toward them. Dealey aggressively fired 3 torpedoes before diving to avoid the oncoming depth charges. As Harder passed below the enemy's ship, she was rattled as her own torpedoes exploded above them. For the next 2 hours, she was bombarded by depth charges. Dealey was convinced that he had sunk the enemy destroyer, but records later showed that the Japanese ship survived the attack. Regardless, Dealey's aggression left Admiral Soimu Toyota convinced that Tawi-Tawi was surrounded by enemy submarines. He ordered Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet to leave the area ahead of schedule, disrupting their plans for the upcoming Battle of the Philippine Sea. USS Harder returned to Fremantle a hero, completing one of the most successful patrols in the history of the United States submarine fleet. Samuel Dealey's 5th Patrol made him a hero in the American submarine fleet, but some worried that the grueling patrols had taken their toll. Admiral Christie, who briefly rode with USS Harder after her 5th Patrol, spent some time with Dealey during his leave. He asked Dealey whether it was time for a break. Command of USS Harder would pass to her executive officer, Frank Lynch, who by this time had well earned the honor. Dealey would return to the United States and then potentially head back to Pearl Harbor as either a staff officer or a squadron commander. Submarine commanders who completed 5 successful missions were usually rewarded with several months back in the United States, a promotion, and command of a newly constructed vessel. But Dealey insisted on commanding Harder's 6th Patrol. Whether this was out of loyalty to his vessel, allegiance to his crew, or a desire for more action is unclear. In any case, Christie was convinced and he allowed Dealey one last patrol. Dealey requested that Frank Lynch remain in port for the next mission to give him some rest. Despite Lynch's protestations, the request was granted. Why Dealey wanted another patrol remains a subject of debate to this day. Some wonder if his reputation as the destroyer killer had given him a false sense of invincibility. These missions were exciting and rewarding for Dealey. With each patrol, he racked up honors. It's possible that he wanted one last round in the fight before returning to a safe and boring life far removed from the action. He liked what he did on USS Harder, and he was good at it. It's not hard to see why he would be reluctant to give that up. USS Harder left Fremantle for her 6th patrol on August 5, 1944. Dealey was in charge of an attack group that consisted of USS Harder, USS Harder, and USS Hake. They sailed for the Philippine coast, south of the Luzon Strait. They were also joined by the submarines Guitarro, Ratan, and Ray. Soon, they encountered a Japanese convoy off Palawan Bay on the island of Mindoro. The group went in for the attack, sinking 4 merchant ships totaling 22,400 tons. Next, Harder and Hado separated from the larger group and moved north to Manila Bay, where they easily picked off 3 900-ton Japanese freighters, Mitsuha, Miburi, and Sato. The 2 subs then moved further north toward Luzon, where they attacked the destroyer Azakazi, which would sink not long after, despite efforts to tow her to safety in Dassel Bay. Using her last torpedo on the attack, Hado broke away to resupply. Harder remained in the area and was soon joined by USS Hake. Knowing that the enemy destroyer survived the initial attack, the 2 American submarines lay just outside Dassel Bay, waiting for the crippled ship to re-emerge. At 5:45 on the morning of August 24, 1944, instead of the crippled destroyer, Harder and Hake spotted 2 other warships emerging from the bay. The first was the Japanese minesweeper, Keiboken CD-22. The second was a strange sight, an ex-American Clemson-class destroyer, the former USS Stewart, which had been abandoned in Java before being discovered, salvaged, and redeployed by the Japanese as Patrol Boat 102. Hake engaged the former US destroyer, but grew suspicious as the enemy ship turned back to the bay. Frank E. Haler, the commander of USS Hake, sensed danger and took evasive maneuvers as CD-22 moved in to confront the American submarines. As Hake moved to safety, Haler briefly spotted Harder's periscope at 6:47, before losing sight of their fellow submarine. Less than an hour later, Hake braced as a barrage of 15 depth charges rocked the water around them. Then, the sea fell silent. Haler remained in the area, and when darkness fell, Hake surfaced and attempted to contact Harder. They continued searching the area for 2 weeks, but the sub was nowhere to be found, and Hake was finally forced to return to base. It soon became clear the Japanese minesweeper's attack succeeded. The loss of Samuel Dealey in the storied USS Harder sent shockwaves through the American submarine fleet. Many felt that the commander was overly exhausted by the time he left for his 6th patrol, but he might have also been a natural risk-taker who simply got unlucky. We'll never know what transpired in those final moments. His record, however, is undeniable. Samuel Dealey sank 16 enemy ships, totaling 54,000 tons, the 5th most successful commander in the submarine fleet. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, only the 4th submarine commander to earn the distinction at the time. USS Harder earned 6 battle stars and the Presidential Unit Citation. While she lived on in the memories of her fellow submariners and the families and friends of her lost crew, USS Harder eventually faded from memory. That was until May 22, 2024, 80 years after her loss, when Lost 52 Project announced that her wreck had been found. She lays nearly intact at a depth of 3,750 feet, or 1,140 meters, in the West Philippine Sea near Luzon, a massive hole on her port side just aft of her conning tower hints at the horror of her final moments, when she was likely hit by a Japanese depth charge, sending Harder and her crew to their graves. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, support the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people.